I will, I'm afraid, read my talk. I'm delighted to be back in Amsterdam, where my passion for psychedelic science was first nurtured. I first took LSD in 1965, and then learned how to work with it in a productive way the following year, when I met a Dutch scientist called Bart Huges. He introduced me to his theories underlying the changes in consciousness brought about by techniques such as yogic deep breathing and the psychedelics, and explained the ego as a conditioned reflex mechanism which controls what enters consciousness and what does not, through the control of the blood supply in the brain. These theories are too complex to go into now, but they changed my life, and I decided to devote my energies to exploring the brain and how to enhance its functioning, and to share this knowledge. Now, 50 years later, we are finally starting to empirically understand the mechanisms underlying the changes in consciousness brought about by psychedelics, and how and why they can be such useful tools in the treatment of many illnesses. So why this gap of 50 years, one might ask? Sadly, because it took that long to drill a hole in the barricade of repression created by the war on drugs. This war was enshrined in the UN conventions and has remained unchanged like a sacred text, although clearly it was based on prejudice and political expediency, not on scientific evidence. Prohibition has been an outstanding failure, causing devastating collateral harms far in excess of the drugs themselves. Although in theory, scientific and medical research into controlled substances was allowed by the conventions, in fact, the obstructions were so great it became impossible. There was no funding, and no institutions or scientists wanted to be involved in research which would damage their reputations and careers. It is an amazing indictment of society that these incredibly important psychoactive compounds that have played such a vital role in our cultural evolution, aiding our development of language, spirituality, music, art, and medicine, became taboo. They have always been at the core of society, shrouded in mystery, but sadly they became toxic in the mind of society, moving from being known as the food of the gods to substances of damnation and criminalization. This move has been a grave mistake for society and has caused untold suffering. Amazingly, now I think we are standing at the threshold of a new era. Suddenly, psychoactive substances are beginning to be recognized for their potential, for spiritual growth and healing, for better understanding of the self, for increased perception of beauty in music, and for enhancing compassion and openness. My introduction to psychedelics was through LSD, and so I retain a great love and dedication to its reintegration into the fabric of society as a tool of incredible value. However, LSD carries a heavy weight of misplaced prejudice unequal to any other substance. Luckily, psilocybin is the word that nobody knows, so it can oil the key to the reopening of the door to psychedelic science, complemented by ayahuasca, which has minimal recreational possibilities. Following the promising explosion of research into LSD, after its discovery, with over 3,000 experimental and clinical studies undertaken, research was brutally terminated at the beginning of the 1970s. The baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and it has taken almost 50 years to undertake the first brain imaging study of its effects in the human brain. Last month, we launched the results of the Beckley Imperial LSD study at the Royal Society in London. I had dedicated many years to undertake research with LSD, and I felt as if an important door had been opened. It was a long journey from Amsterdam in 1966 to the Royal Society in 2016, and an important step on the way was setting up the Beckley Foundation in 1998. Becoming a foundation adds gravitas to someone like me with no letters after my name. The foundation has two main aims. Firstly, to investigate the mechanisms underlying consciousness and its changing states, and secondly, to reform global drug policies. The two are closely interrelated. Over the years, I've undertaken many collaborations with leading scientists around the world. My partnership with Dave Nutt has been particularly rewarding. It began in 2005 when I encouraged him to join me in the research of psychedelics. Soon after, Robin K. Harris visited me, and I suggested he did his PhD with David. In 2009, David moved to Imperial, and we began the Beckley Imperial Research Programme, co-directed by Dave and me, with Robin as lead investigator. Since then, the team has grown in a wonderful manner, including Mendel, Leo, Christopher, and David Arizio, all of whom have given talks at this conference. Our first study investigated the effects of psilocybin using fMRI, ASL, and MEG. The study was particularly revealing about the default mode network. This study led to the Medical Research Council, a government body, funding our recent psilocybin for depression study. We later did similar explorations with MDMA, and finally broke the boundaries to the forbidden territory of LSD. In 2013, I began another productive collaboration with Jordi Riba. Jordi is a long-standing researcher of ayahuasca, and now we're expanding the field to include the investigations of DMT and 5-MeO-DMT. Our latest in vitro study has revealed some very important data, which Jordi will describe later today. What I'd like to share with you today is why, in my opinion, psychedelics are such essential tools in gaining a better understanding of consciousness, and why they're proving to be such an effective treatment of many of man's most intractable illnesses, including addiction and depression. Their great gift is that they bring about profound changes in consciousness that no other substances do. They enable us to compare normal daily consciousness with the altered states they generated in a reliable way, states which have similarities not only to psychosis, and creative breakthroughs, and also peak moments of human experience. Key elements of the psychedelic experience are ego dissolution, altered awareness, and a greater depth of feeling. We and others have found that the changes in consciousness that psychedelics bring about leave profound, lasting effects, such as increased openness, optimism, and improved well-being. They seem to be able to reset rigid patterns of thought and behavior which underlie many mental disorders. What is interesting is how these changes happen, and our research is helping clarify this. Using different but complementary brain imaging techniques, together with behavioral measures, we are beginning to put together the pieces of the puzzle. The picture that emerges is somewhat similar to the reducing valve hypothesis of Aldous Huxley. What we're finding is that the normal, highly organized and structural way of how the brain works disappears, and under the effects of psychedelics is replaced by a different, more chaotic or entropic mode. According to the entropic brain theory, the psychedelic state is characterized by a higher degree of entropy or chaos than the normal waking consciousness. This increase in chaos results from the fact that the usual top-down constraints are disrupted, thereby increasing excitability in sensory, memory, and emotional centers, and creating a shift from ordinary waking consciousness to a state more similar to dreaming or infancy, where the mind is more emotionally flexible and everything feels novel, fluid, and dynamic. As infants grow, the brain becomes more sophisticated, more specialized, more efficient at what needs to be done, but also more rigid and constrained. Psychedelics disrupt the balance, breaking up the fixed patterns of communication and giving rise to new patterns of brain connectivity. Normally, without psychedelics, the brain function is a very organized manner, with distinct networks doing their separate tasks, for example, motor function, vision, hearing. There are also higher order networks, an important one being the default mode network, which behaves rather like the conductor in the orchestra. This network is also important for introspection, daydreaming, memory, and maintaining the sense of self, and is very prominent when the person is not engaged in a goal-related task. Hyperactivity of the default mode network has been associated with several mental illnesses, such as anxiety, depression, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Psychedelics disrupt the connectivity within this network, and the degree of this disruption is mirrored in the experience of ego dissolution, a loss of the sense of self. We see the same patterns of disruption in many other networks as well, namely that the connectivity within the network decreases and the connectivity between the networks increases. This results in the whole brain becoming more integrated, allowing new connections to be performed between brain areas which normally do not speak to each other. It is experienced as a sense of oneness or unity, such as mystics experience through endogenous means and years of training. The ayahuasca research carried out by Jordi Riba as part of the Beckley Research Programme leads to similar conclusions, including the reduction in brain rhythms and changes in resting state connectivity, which reduces the grip of the default mode network over sensory and emotional areas. Moreover, we find that these changes persist as an afterglow for at least 24 hours after the acute effects of ayahuasca subside. Jordi specifically looks at changes in connectivity between higher cognitive areas and areas associated with emotion. We find that these areas become more connected after ayahuasca, and this correlates with increased mindfulness scores. People become less judgmental and get a better insight to their own emotions. The increase in mindful scores are comparable to those of experienced meditators and last for at least 2 months after the initial experience. In addition to the changes in consciousness and personality described above, psychedelics can also shed light on phenomenon of visual hallucinations. In our LSD study, we find that when resting with eyes closed, the visual areas of the brain were the only regions to show increased blood flow after LSD. All the imaging measures showed changes that we would normally see with visual stimulation, even though participants had their eyes closed. These changes correlated with self-reported visual hallucinations demonstrating seeing with the eyes shut, consistent with ayahuasca research. Moreover, the visual areas were much more connected with the rest of the brain under LSD than with placebo. The above principles apply not only to simple geometric patterns, but also to complex visions, which are deeply influenced by memory and emotions. We also explored the interaction of LSD with music. We found that LSD enhances the emotional response to music, creating a deeper and stronger experience than with placebo. There was increased brain connectivity when the music was present. The regions involved in emotional memories, such as the parahippocampus, affected the visual regions more. The results provide strong support for the use of music in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to enhance personal memory and mental imagery. This part of the study was led by Mendel Kalem. Finally, in addition to helping us understand how the brain works and informing us about various states of consciousness, psychedelics have very important practical implications, including in the treatment of depression, addiction, anxiety, and other conditions. Studies in which we're involved include the Beckley Imperial psilocybin study for treatment-resistant depression, already mentioned. After 2 doses of psilocybin in a supportive clinical setting, all patients showed some improvement in their symptoms. 67% were depression-free 1 week after treatment, and 42% were still in remission 3 months later. Even though the study was very small, the results are remarkable. Participants who, on average, had been depressed for 18 years reported decreased anxiety, increased optimism, and an ability to enjoy things. For some, the improvement has lasted for months. We've also seen great results in the Johns Hopkins study, led by Roland Griffiths and Matthew Johnson, which uses psilocybin for overcoming nicotine addiction. Again, the sample size was small, but the success rate was astounding. 12 subjects, all of whom had tried to quit smoking multiple times using various methods, were verified as nicotine-free 6 months after treatment, a success rate of 80%. The psychedelic experience seems to allow many subjects to reframe and then break a lifelong habit. The volunteers who reported a more complete mystical experience had greater success in breaking the habit. The study is now being expanded and will include a brain imaging component. I'm very excited about the future, with many new and exciting studies taking shape with various collaborators around the world. The field of psychedelic science is certainly an abundant orchard with much low-hanging fruit, and I feel confident that it will grow exponentially, making the world a happier place. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, for your eloquent talk. So we are open for questions, if there are some. Yeah, you have to go up to the microphone, please.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is, could you elaborate a little bit on what you did in the United Nations? I think you did some work in trying to get the war on drugs less.
It is about your engagement in the UN. What is the question exactly?
Yeah, what I tried to know is if you could elaborate on what you did with the United Nations in a higher platform in order to get drugs more into a normal, let's say, daily use of people.
Well, you know? It's been a long trip, but I used to have meetings with their main policy advisor, Sandeep Chawla, who actually agreed with most of what I said. And I was particularly pushing the case of cannabis and the psychedelics. And what I noticed at the UN and other meetings from 1998 onwards is that cannabis was never mentioned, although it was the vast majority of illegal drug taking. It and psychedelics were never mentioned. So I commissioned by the top experts a book called Cannabis Policy Moving Beyond Stalemate, which had a global overview of cannabis and brought to the attention that it was the elephant in the room. It was needed to spend $100 billion a year on prohibition of drugs, because without that, there was only 1% of the world's population taking illegal drugs.
Exactly.
So I over the years, gave meetings of kind of top policy experts, scientists, and I was always pushing towards regulation. That's always been what I've been in favour of. And I'm still pushing towards that.
Thank you. But could you give some pointers? I mean, what could, let's say, a normal scientist like me do in order to drill holes in the current legislation, you know, in policies?
Yeah.
So he was asking what a scientist like he can do to put some holes in the
yeah, I think the only way to really reform drug policy is through science. I think the two approaches are deeply interrelated, and with the best scientific evidence, we can slowly move the policy forward. And the two interfeed each other. The policy allows the research to take place, which, I mean, 5 years ago, one couldn't do LSD research, but now slowly it moves forward. And in turn, the research feeds into policy, and hopefully what I'm pushing for now is to reschedule cannabis and the psychedelics from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 as a minimal, so that research can be done and doctors can prescribe. But I think what I did, which was fairly new, was bring scientists into the room to inform drug policy. And I did that through a series of meetings at the House of Lords.
Excellent. Thank you.
I just want to pronounce that Amanda's meetings were high class and also the only alternative kind of information which was dispersed into these kind of gremia and committees and so on. So it was a really important and impactful event what she organized there, or these events were of very much impact to the community there, because they don't, usually these high-ranking politicians, they don't have any really science background, and so you have to inform and instruct them, and therefore these meetings were of very much worse, I guess. So there's another question.
Would you like to elaborate on how you envision the role of psychedelics in society in longer term, like in several decades, if the research keeps proceeding as planned?
Right. Well, I think psychedelics have immense value and potential. And I mean, one way is to look at what is possible within the government. And I think treating illness is obviously the first way forward. But they also have immense value to the individual. And I would hope we see centres coming, one where people can go and have treatment for all the different conditions they need with psychedelic-aided therapy. But also it'd be very nice to have places where people could go and feel safe and to be introduced and experience themselves the psychedelic state. But that is obviously further off. I mean, if you know, in the cities there were community centres where young people could have the experience of a psychedelic with the guidance of a good guide, it could be very transformational. But we aren't at that stage yet, kind of thing, in society. But we are definitely moving towards the therapeutic use of these substances. And I think that's a great step forward, which has only happened in the last few years. And that, because I think we're having exceptionally high rates of success, I think that will flow out into society. I mean, at the moment I'm working with the Jamaican government, and I think they're desperately in need of income, and they could be a very good home for scientific research using cannabis and psychedelics, and also centres where people can go and have treatment. But there are many of those places I think will bud up around the world. And it would be a great gain for society, I think.
Thank you again, Amanda, for all your engagement during all the decades. Okay, we go on with our next speaker, who is